Hi, this is David Gornoski, host of A Neighbor's Choice and Things Hidden podcast, as well as some of our other programs like Science and You with our chief science advisor, Dr. Yu, and our seed oil survival series that we continue to have great fun unpacking the truth of nutrition. I wanted to give you a quick little message saying we appreciate all the support that we get from our uh, monthly contributors and our one-time donation supporters. And we'd encourage all of you to go to our website, a neighborschoice.com, click on contribute, and make a monthly pledge today, whether it's $1, $5, 15, 20, 50, whatever you want to do. Doesn't matter. Just be a part of building this new media project that we've developed to empower and inform, to inspire, to kickstart a scientific renaissance, an anthropological breakthrough and reformation in the church. All these things are possible with your support right now. So make that commitment today and help us keep doing the productions that we have. Thank you. What does it mean to be a good neighbor, and what does it mean to be a bad citizen? We're going to find out today on our program. I'm David Gornoski, your host, here with Domenic Scarcella. How you doing, sir?
I'm great. How are you, David? It's wonderful to finally meet you in person after consuming some of your great content that I found online. So it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, very good. It's I think we're going to have a fun, fruitful conversation. You're on A Neighbor's Choice, and you're talking about a good neighbor. So I think we're going to have a lot of commonality here. You've got a new a book out that I want to just at the outset describe for our audience, because this is what we'll be unpacking today. Some of the takeaway points of this book. It's called Good Neighbor, Bad Citizen: Reflections on the Core Social Conflict revealed by Jesus Christ's Way of the Cross. And it was just out, it published in October of last year, so it's hot off the presses. And I'll just read the description to set the context. Jesus Christ preaches and models what it means to be a good neighbor. He is also frequently considered a bad citizen. There is no escaping this tension. Being a good neighbor requires a different mindset and value system than being a good citizen. They often conflict. Explore this tension and conflict by following the 14 traditional stations of the cross and a bonus 15 station with Jesus and the people he encounters along the way. So that's an interesting framing of Jesus's way. Why did you choose the stations of the cross and use it as your foundation for what it means to be a good neighbor, bad citizen?
Because first of all, it's very obvious in Jesus's persecution that he's a bad citizen, right? I mean, good
Yeah,
citizens don't get executed
yeah, yeah.
by the government. Good citizens aren't paraded through the streets to scare other people into compliance. So it's during his final hours alive and in human form that that all of his ministry comes to a head and gets really crystallized and expanded upon. And part of why I use the Stations of the Cross is because it's a framework that's already there. So I'm not a very inventive person, so I can't write. I'm not very good at creating characters and creating settings and writing a narrative like that. I was more of I was a sports reporter. It was my first profession years and years ago. So I watch what's happening and I know how to report it, but I can't create a game.
Yeah.
So the narrative is there for me. If you know the Gospels, the narrative is there. You don't have to invent any characters. You don't have to invent any backstories. You don't have to invent a setting and drama and
Yeah.
action and reality. It's there. You just have to dig into it carefully, logically, attentively, and deeply, and make the effort. And there's so much there to learn.
Right, right. Well, you're right, and it's true that to be a good neighbor means you're going to be a bad citizen in a lot of different ways. You mentioned before we started the show that social status is not defined by your, what did you say, occupation, or how would you describe it?
Authority does not come from social status.
Yeah,
Truth does not come from authority.
sure.
Truth does not come from social status.
Yeah,
In popular culture, especially in America, we like to think that it does.
yeah,
Like everybody has earned their position in
yeah,
society.
yeah,
You can be whatever you put your mind to. You know,
yeah,
a merit-based society. Some aspects of our society are merit-based, but it's I think it's naive to assume that everybody with a fancy title or with social status or who's been given a position of authority and presented that way has somehow discovered truth. Look at government, look at celebrities. I mean, these are people who have some skills, but I wouldn't say that truth is a property of authority. I mean, in the best of all worlds, it happens the other way around, right? Your pursuit of truth is what gets you status.
Yeah.
Your pursuit and discovery of truth may lead you to be someone who can point to reality for others and maybe be that kind of leader. But flipping it around, from what I've observed, it's just not true.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's true that so many people, and it's a specialist knowledge, culture that we're in, where oh, you have a lab coat and everything, therefore I'll take some poison that you give me, or whatever it is. That is a fatally, a fatal part of so much of our dominant society. But and you get a lot of that mindset seeping into how so many people feel the need to have a muscular, aggressive government, right, that asserts itself through force in various different ways. And there's a lot of critiques going on in the, let's say, the right wing of the failure of the do not tread on me paradigm of liberalism or liberty, right? You hear that a lot, right? You hear a lot of right wingers saying, look, we're dealing with such, aggressive, dominating forces in the form of leftism and progressivism that we do not have time for these quaint notions of do not tread on me to get us through the finish line, because these guys, they say silence is violence, which means if you're silent in terms of you're not mouthing support for their agenda, you are an enemy of theirs. Whereas ours is a weak position saying, as long as you do not use force against me, leave me alone, please. And the leave me alone crowd's always going to take a submissive, a submissive role to that dominating force of kind of the totality of we're taking over the whole culture. It's going to be run like leftism. It's endless pursuit of victims to, to create pantheons of idolatry, as what I would say victimism and leftism does. And the right says we don't have time for this libertarianism or liberalism, and I say, yeah, you're right. We don't. We need to get a real source of it, which is Christianity. That those things like libertarianism and liberalism, where they fall short, it's because they're not radical enough in the embrace of the imitation of Christ. Would you agree with that?
I would agree that if we actually stopped looking outside of ourselves for validation all the time, you see the evils of government, and what you were describing from the right is people saying, well, let's get in that game and try to dominate them instead.
Yeah.
Whereas the call of the Christian is to undermine that. And I think it's the difference between meek with an M and weak with a W.
Yeah.
Right? Meek people are strong people. Yeah. Meek is a virtue. Weak is not.
Yeah.
So we can appear weak because we're not dominating others. We're not trying to impose ourselves on others. But there's a strength there. And, people who are only looking at the power structures and the social status, they might miss the fact that there are black markets going on. There's agorism going on. There's plenty of people undermining the hierarchical structure, the imposed order. They're doing it quietly, but they're doing it effectively. We're not bragging about it because our goal is to do good, not to just one up the people who are doing evil.
So that gets into kind of a paradigm we get into on the show a lot, mimetic desire and one-upping your neighbor, right? The left and right are so obsessed with one-upping each other and dominating the other that they lose sight of what it is they're supposed to be for and what they're in favor of. It's just a negation of the other, right? I must defeat you. I must defeat you. No, I must defeat you. No, I must defeat you. And the more Rene Girard says that the more the anthropologists behind mimetic theory, the more people compete for the same object, in this case, power and social status, the more alike they become, and they look to third party
Yes.
observers, right? Now, when you're
Yes.
when you're involved in the rivalry, you feel as if you could be further apart from your heathen neighbor that's a lefty or a right winger, but
Uh-huh.
to a third party observation, they look almost identical, right? And that's what he calls mimetic doubling. That the more you compete, he's famous for saying, be careful who your enemies are, you will become like them. And I think that's taken from the Bible, right? That which you idolize oftentimes becomes that which you become, right? And oftentimes our rivals are actually idols, right? And we don't want to admit that. It's like the flip side of idolatry. You're a monster is very much can easily become an idol of fixation.
Sure.
You know what I mean? And so if you're fixated on the Trumpers are the monsters, then you become like the fascism that you imagine them to have.
Yes.
And if you think the other way, leftists are nihilistic power mongers or whatever, and you want to beat them, you end up becoming more and more like them. You know, the lying that you see them doing, the violence that you see them doing, the carelessness for the human person you see them doing, all of that ends up becoming part of your modus operandi as well, because you're fixated on idolizing your neighbor rather than, being a good neighbor like you're talking about.
And we see that in Jesus's way of the cross.
Right.
Here's the occupying Roman regime and the Israelite more localized regime, and they have so much not in common with each other. They're at each other's throats, but then there are other times when they seem to be such perfect allies,
Right.
and suddenly they become like each other, and they do that to Jesus. Suddenly, it's the Sanhedrin and the Israelite leaders working in perfect harmony with their supposed Roman oppressors that they
Yeah.
oppose, and
Yeah.
they're working in tandem to get rid of this guy that none of them can quite figure out. If Jesus had marched in with a rival army, they would have known how to deal with him. But
Exactly.
he
Yeah.
didn't do that,
Yeah.
and they couldn't figure him out. Jesus is good chaos, right? Jesus brings good chaos to a
Yeah.
bunch of control freaks and order worshippers,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
they
For
can't
sure.
figure out what to do with them. And so
Yeah.
now these competing control freaks, they come together
Right.
to get rid of
Right.
this guy who's meek but not weak at all.
And paradoxically, Jesus' supposed chaos in relation to their order is actually orderly, and their order is actually chaotic, right? Especially in light of what he does on the cross, where he exposes the futility of their whole power
Yes.
system, right? He exposes the impotence of the powers on the cross when they crown him as the king, you know, on the cross. He's lifted up and he
It,
draws all
it's
man unto him, right?
it is. It's the difference between an imposed order, which is what the Romans and all governments do.
Right,
They're imposing order,
right,
versus a what economists might call a spontaneous order, or what we in religious language would call a revealed order,
right.
meaning that connections exist, but they are ours to discover, not ours to invent for our own selfish desires and then try to force onto other people.
Yeah,
So Jesus brings um, an awareness of how beautiful the unknown is, because the unknown gives you something to seek and
hmm,
something to explore. And it is in that seeking and that exploration that you find a type of order that's so much better than the imposed order, the muck of good
yeah,
citizenship,
yeah,
as I call it.
yeah,
So yes, there's from our perspective, the unknown can be chaos.
yeah.
But if we make the effort, we find out that there are connections even in there. And that's another theme that I go through in the book. I go through so much more than just those few hours of and those maybe chapter or two that you see in the canonical gospels talking about Jesus's way of the cross and death. I bring in stuff from much earlier in his ministry that connects to what happens to him on the cross.
Give us
Um,
a couple examples. Like, what comes to mind?
um, the temptation in the desert before his ministry begins. I go through each of the three temptations that are described as the devil tempting Jesus before he begins his ministry when he's out there fasting for 40 days in the desert. And we go through each of the temptations, which are turn these stones into food. That's a temptation. Do that, because it's just a magic trick that satisfies the human condition. Another one is why don't you go to the top of this tall building at the temple, the parapet of the temple, and throw yourself down and have your angels rescue you. Well, that's the temptation to do the magic trick of just kind of denying the human condition. It's like, just pretend that the human condition doesn't really exist. And then there's the other temptation, which is when it's described as the devil taking Jesus and showing him all of the world's kingdoms and saying, these I will give to you. They belong to me, and I will give them to you if you will bow down to me. And not only is that a very clear example that the world's regimes, these coercive civil authorities, these imposed hierarchical social orders are of the devil, because Jesus doesn't refute that point. All Jesus says is, you shall not put the Lord to the test in that instance. And that's the other temptation that Jesus will have during his public ministry, which is, why don't you just oppress the human condition? So why don't you just satiate the human condition? Why don't you just deny it and make it so that it doesn't have to exist as it does?
Yeah.
Or why don't you just oppress it? And of course, Christ's answer to all of that consistently is to say no to each of those, because he's not here to satiate, to deny, or to oppress. He's here to redeem the human condition.
Right.
He's here to show us that despite our limitations, there must be something beautiful about this human life, about being human. And maybe you wouldn't know it by watching a guy be persecuted and tortured on his way to death.
Yeah.
But Jesus reveals how beautiful the human condition is by how he responds to the people who like him and to the people who hate him.
Yeah. Very good. I was thinking when you mentioned that stone temptation, how immediately, I do a lot of looking at the stone motifs all throughout the Bible, and they talk about, Jesus talks about I am the stone the builders rejected, right?
Yes.
And I've become the cornerstone. And I was just thinking, in some ways, he fulfills that temptation in his own way, because he becomes the stone the builders rejected, which is the bread of life for all mankind.
Yes.
So he doesn't turn those rocks as an object into bread for his own satiation, but he satiates humanity by being the stone that is then the bread of life that all people are to partake in his Lord's Supper, right? The Eucharist. So
Yes.
it's interesting how he goes beyond. He doesn't. That's a foreshadowing, I think, in that text. You want to take this the bad way, or you want to do it the right way? Do you want to objectify these stones in a satiating manner for your temporary physical hunger, or do you want to provide the kind of being that other people can partake of in their journey, right, by not taking the shortcut for the magic tricks of life and being Christ in their moments, right? So I think that's interesting there.
Yeah, there's something I wrote recently in a Substack article, because I do have a Substack that goes by the same name, Good Neighbor, Bad Citizen, where I try to take this conversation from the book and just with a short weekly reflection, build on it. And I do talk about some of that theme that, of course, there is foreshadowing in the things we do, but like you're saying, there's the instant magic trick of being satisfied, of being satiated right away.
Yeah.
That stands in contrast to the journey of a saint, right? And we're all called to be saints. We're all called to be people who eventually reach that happiness, that friendship with the divine transcendence, with what we call God. But that happens incrementally. You travel it by foot. You can't hop in a time machine and just jump to the end. You can't find something that'll get you there so quickly that you bypass all of the scenery and all of the experience that your daily life gives you. The getting to the real bread of life is not something that you just snap your fingers.
Exactly. It takes
there
cultivation.
It's cultivated. It's
exactly.
Yes, it's how we experience the world linearly. There's a past, there's a present, there's a future. And while we point to an eternity where those distinctions won't matter anymore, as far as we are now, they matter. right? They matter. We get a glimpse of the transcendence. That's our soul. That's what spurs us forward. But at the same time, we get that glimpse within a life full of limitation.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to properly navigate our limitation to get to the better things, the
Right.
better parts of our life right now and the better parts of our life continuing. I tell students that I teach, because I do teach some religious education through my parishes over the years. I tell them, eternity begins as soon as you realize it. Not completely, but it begins as soon as you start noticing it and pursuing it.
Right. Right. Because
It's the
it's not about
journey, not
because it's not about escaping this earth, right? It's
no.
about heaven coming to earth. I think that's so important.
It's about finding God where you are, realizing that God is in your soul, and realizing that the limitations you have here on earth are not permanent. Your life doesn't stop here on earth.
Right.
As far as we can tell, it begins here on earth,
Right.
but it doesn't stop here. That's the soul. That's the glimpse of the transcendent
Yeah.
that we find stirring in our souls. That's the divine.
Right.
That's grace. And grace can lead us to faith if we answer that call, right? Grace is God calling us. Grace is God sharing his life in our lives. And then faith is when we answer that call and say, I want to move in that direction. I want to find that. And that movement is not all at once and not instantaneous.
Yeah.
It's something that we wrestle with. The word Israel means one who wrestles with
Yeah.
God.
Wrestle with God. Yeah.
Right. And I also tell students to do that. I say, don't be afraid to wrestle with God. And then I make wrestling poses and grunt at them. And if they don't run out of the room screaming, I know they maybe got some toughness to them.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's where we are. This is our journey. This is our
Yeah.
struggle, but it's a good struggle if we do it the right way. For a Christian, the ends do not justify the means. If anything,
Right.
it's the other way around. The
Right.
means can justify the ends. If
Yeah.
we do the journey correctly, if we do the journey in a good manner, if we do the struggle in a good manner, then we can live with the results. And of course, Jesus's hope is not only can you live with the results, but eventually those results are going to be more wonderful than you could have imagined.
Yeah. And it's not about, again, I want to emphasize, it's not about escaping this earth, because that would be kind of a detached Platonic view of, mind and, soul and body detached and distinct and so forth. We don't accept that. We believe heaven is invading earth. And when Jesus says the kingdom of God is within you, it's not a singular there, it's actually plural. He said, you all. The kingdom of God is within you all, as that your collective, your body manifests the kingdom as a reality, and his resurrection is a down payment on that reality that is then worked out through history. So I'm very optimistic that everything about what we see in the physical world today, as Paul describes, is a seed of what's to come in some type of upgraded physical reality that we are to anticipate, right? Creation is groaning for its redemption. And I think that trees are a seed of something better than trees, that we'll see trees and our bodies, and mountains are a seed, and planet Earth is a seed, and Saturn is a seed. All these things are going to be even more enhanced. And that's what we are to participate with God in bringing into history. And that's what it means to be a good neighbor, right? So let's go through some of those stations, or anywhere you see some takeaway points that might be interesting for folks to dive into with your book. I'm not as familiar with the Stations of the Cross, but go ahead.
Okay. The Stations of the Cross are there's 14 traditional Stations of the Cross, and they're incremental places along Jesus's persecution.
Right.
I do go through it in the introduction to the book. There's an introduction to the book. By the way, the whole book I'm holding up now on camera. This book was almost too thin for Amazon and Barnes and Noble and Lulu to print it.
As opposed to the U.S. tax code, right?
As opposed to the U.S. Yeah, this is not a taxing book. Wink, wink, right? But I go through in the introduction what the Stations of the Cross are. They're Pilate condemns Jesus. Jesus takes his cross. Then Jesus falls. He meets his mother. Simon helps carry his cross. There's a woman named Veronica who wipes Jesus's face. Jesus falls the second time. Jesus consoles the weeping women. Jesus falls the third time. And then when he gets to Golgotha, Jesus is stripped. Jesus is nailed to the cross. Jesus dies on the cross. And then Jesus is removed from the cross. Like, that's a very important thing as well. And Jesus is placed in the tomb. And then I add one more to get to 15, which is eventually that tomb is empty, right? And so I trace where all of these stations, except the Veronica one, can be either explicitly or implicitly found in the canonical Gospels. So it's traditional, but it's also recorded mostly in Scripture. And a lot of these things contain details that the early audience of the Gospels would not need to be written out for them. Like, what is a crucifixion?
Yeah.
They knew what a crucifixion was. They were occupied by Romans.
Yeah.
They knew exactly what they didn't need the details for that. They knew what a crucifixion was. They knew what it meant to have to carry. They knew what a cross was. They knew what it meant to have to carry that cross to your place of execution. So these details, that it's so condensed in the Gospels. It's just barely a chapter in each of the Gospels, but there's a ton of information there. And so the stations of the cross are, they're also very much a part of early Christianity, because Christianity is a pilgrimage religion, not only spiritually, but also quite physically. There were early Christians who would go back to these places and actually walk the path that Jesus walked. The development of what we call Easter, that holiday in English, Easter, which they still call Pasqua in some of the Romance languages, Passover. The development of that holiday is because it's a pilgrimage time of year. Christians from the outlying areas would very quietly go to Jerusalem, and they would walk Jesus's way of the cross, because these were real landmarks and places within the city. This isn't fiction. This isn't something that someone invented. It's not pure mythology up on a Mount Olympus somewhere.
Right.
And so this very real, earthy, brutal sequence of events is such a part of early Christianity. And I think losing that connection we lose that connection at our own peril, being almost 2,000 years removed from it. So those are the stations of the cross. It's breaking down this very real event into increments that can be meditated upon and reflected upon piece by piece, but understanding that those pieces connect.
You mentioned taking down from the cross. What is the importance of that in your message?
Well, the importance of that is when the Romans would crucify someone, they would just leave them up there to maybe rot and be picked at by the vultures and the scavengers. For Jesus's very few allies to go and ask for Jesus's body was an act of great courage, because first of all, it identified you as someone who was with that guy.
Yeah.
You open yourself up to the risk of now you get persecuted too.
Yeah.
So for the people who went and asked for Jesus's body to give him a proper burial, that's an act of great courage. And it also shows us why we consider burying the dead to be one of the acts of mercy. It's not that we celebrate death. It's that we understand that each of us has a human body. This is how we experience the world, and we have a great respect for that. I don't know if you like people to read from
sure, go ahead.
things on it, but one of the things about Jesus being removed from the cross, to ask for Jesus's body is to risk being similarly publicly categorized as a bad citizen, but it's a neighborly thing to do. And it recalls a scriptural novella, the book of Tobit, and its protagonist. And if you're familiar with I quote just a little bit from the book of Tobit about how the protagonist in that story goes out to bury the faithful Israelites who had been killed and just thrown out to rot. He gives them a proper burial. And in the next station where Jesus is placed in the tomb, we talk about, well, why is it a big deal that he's placed in the tomb? Well, the people who place him in the tomb don't know yet that he's going to rise. They're placing him in the tomb just for the fact that doing that is beautiful. And I write in there, but why care about what happens to a person's remains? Can mercy really be shown to a corpse? A body is how a human being experiences the world. To properly treat a deceased person's body is to respect and love the human condition, limits included. and the very miracle of being itself. It's a reverence not of death, but of a life that, in more ways than one, mattered. It's an acknowledgement of the unique temporal journey traveled by a precious, eternal soul.
Mm-hmm.
And these are the things that, these are the quiet moments of grace and strength and virtue that you see even in the midst of something terrible and heinous.
Mm-hmm.
And it's part of that. So that's part of what we're supposed to learn from Jesus dying. You know, you talked before about not trying to escape this world and wait for the next. And unfortunately, Christians have done that in past centuries, and maybe you're still doing that today. You know, oh, this life doesn't matter. It's just only the next one. There's also a tendency for Christians to want to escape the cross, the persecution, and the passion and the death, and get right to the resurrection. But there are lessons to be learned if you don't escape the cross, if you're trying not to run away from the cross.
Mm-hmm.
There are beautiful lessons right there. And they teach us about our lives now, not only about what we hope will be much later, hopefully much later for us. I don't know anybody who wants this all to end for them tomorrow, you know. But we don't want to escape the cross because we're so focused on the resurrection.
In my work, I've written about this idea that turning of the cheek is a social ordering principle. Do you see that in the same way?
I go through that exact passage in here because it's one of the most misinterpreted passages in Christianity. Let's see if I can find it. It's not a very long book, so I'll find it pretty quickly. I go through it in Station 5 when we talk about Simon helping Jesus carry the cross. You know, Jesus is struggling to carry the cross, so the Romans press into service.
Mm-hmm.
This guy who's just standing there and say, "Hey, you, get over here.
Mm-hmm.
You're now carrying this cross." And, you know, they're going to kill him if he doesn't. So Simon goes ahead and carries the cross. And I say, their solution is to press into service an Israelite, a practice noted by Jesus during a lesson on dignified defiance found in the Sermon on the Mount. And I go through those 2.5 verses there from Matthew chapter 5, verses 39b to 41. When someone strikes you on your right cheek, turn the other one to him as well. If anyone wants to go to law with you over your tunic, hand him your cloak as well. Should anyone press you into service for 1 mile, go with him for 2 miles. And I reflect on this. In each of these 3 cases, Jesus preaches defiance of the rigidly hierarchical social order. In other words, Jesus teaches to be a good neighbor, but a bad citizen. First, most people are right-handed, whether naturally or with lots of practice. You didn't want to be left-handed back then. They would think you were of the devil.
Mm-hmm.
So you were right-handed, either by naturally or you made yourself that way. To be struck on the right cheek means you've received a backhanded slap, which was done by superiors to inferiors. Offering your left cheek is to declare yourself defiantly to be your striker's equal. That is not Jesus telling us to let people walk all over us. Mm-hmm. It's Jesus teaching us to assert our dignity without doing the evil in return to the other person. It's the same thing with the next thing. Second, a cloak was a vital possession that could not be withheld from its owner overnight. And I refer people to Exodus there. To a plaintiff who would use the courts to take your tunic over a debt, giving him your cloak would suddenly turn the plaintiff's own cherished legalism against him. So again, Jesus is teaching defiance. Mm-hmm. Defiance, not go along to get along. He's teaching defiance, but in a dignified way. And third, the Roman occupiers of Palestine, as they called it, could force a local man into hard labor, but only for a maximum of 1 mile. To keep going beyond a mile put the Roman at risk of punishment if his superiors found out. Another dignity-asserting act of defiance. So I'm glad you brought that up. It's one of those, this is one of those callbacks I do while talking about the stations of the cross and Jesus's way of the cross. Is that
that's good, yeah.
There are things he's talked about elsewhere in his public ministry They refer to it, and there are quite a few of those in here where I go through the statist interpretation of the gospel and how it's probably not right.
Right, right. Yeah.
Because there's another interpretation that fits more consistently with everything that Jesus taught. And that's one of them. The turn the other cheek is one of them. People don't know what that means. They don't get the context. And not only do they just not know what it means, but they assume it means something that's almost the opposite of what it's supposed to be. And
I think it's also turning of the cheek is also, it has that dimension of dignifying the person caught under the oppressive yoke, but it also has, in my opinion, a proactive connotation in the sense of not just creative nonviolent resistance, but also a proactive way of dismantling evil. So I use the turning of the cheek principle to explain why something like drug legalization is a Christian, conduct, right? Because you're allowing the weight of the person, let's say the drug cartels, their desire for money is what drives them to sell this, right? Their desire for power and control. But by legalizing it, it's a nonviolent turning of the cheek against this. You're not resisting it with violence. Think about the shame of, man, you've disgraced my neighborhood by selling drugs, so to speak, in an abstract sense. You've disgraced my community. You've shamed us by getting this toxic drugs and so forth. But when you open it up without using the state, what happens is that monopoly profit margin evaporates, right? And so they fall on the face of their own exertion, right? I'm selling you this drug because I want to make these kind of monies, but you're not going to make that kind of money if you turn the other cheek against that disrespectful or ugly vice of trying to get people hooked on a drug. Does that make sense? So I see turning of the cheek as just like the way of the cross, as a nonviolent social aikido, allowing evil to fall in on its own weight, is a proactive strategy of defeating it rather than just kind of hoping for the best. No, when you allow evil to exert itself and you don't meet it with a fist, if you allow it to kind of exert itself, it has a tendency to kind of punch back onto the person. You swing and you miss and hit yourself, so to speak, or, you lunge at someone and you move out of the way like Aikido and allow them to collapse on their own inertia. And that, I think, is a foundation of the nonviolent way of Christ in politics and society.
It's dignified defiance. Some people in the anarchy and voluntary space call it building parallel solutions. Government schools are terrible. So what do? Well, we homeschool, we build micro schools, we find other ways to impart learning. The university system is becoming corrupt and expensive and more about status and compliance and regulations and cronyism than about actually developing life skills and good character. So what do you do that? Well, there are alternatives to that as well. Mainstream media becomes too cronyistic. So what happens? Well, there's people like you, David, who create an alternative to that using some very wonderful technological tools like Zoom, like streaming audio, like all the things that we can do. And now you get an alternative message out to people. Dignified defiance, it in so many ways does exactly what you're saying. It dismantles the stranglehold that these imposed institutions have on people, and at some point they're going to collapse under their own weight, right?
Exactly. Do you see it though, like I'm saying, that it cuts both ways? It cuts against the tyranny of the state, but also cuts against the supposed wicked and the wickedness and the vices that the state is supposed to stomp out too. Does that make sense?
Oh yes, and your example of drugs.
Like if I don't like cartels are a stronghold too, like drug cartels, right? They're a stronghold. They're a tyranny. They fillet people alive in certain countries. They're horrible. So how do you beat them? That's the question. How do you stop that?
Right? And isn't it ironic that the government puts itself as we're against the cartels, but really they're the only things keeping the cartels alive.
Exactly.
It goes back to something you said very early in our conversation about talking about the mimetic.
Yeah, mimetic doubling. Yeah,
the mimetic doubling. The cartels don't want drugs to be legalized.
Right.
It would break their. They almost have a government granted monopoly, like the post office.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That's why we find out intelligence agencies being involved in the drug trade as well.
Sure.
Afghanistan and cocaine and all that. Yeah.
Yes, and the opposite way, I wouldn't be surprised to find out that there are people paid by the cartels to lobby against legalization in the halls of government.
Yeah. 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 Well, let me push back on some of the things that I hear. Let me see if I
Good,
can
good,
get
good.
you some
Please.
pushback based on the principles of your book of being a good neighbor, bad citizen.
Sure, please
What
do.
about folks that say, "Okay, well, you're smuggling in market ideology. This is you're bringing in individualism in here, and yes, there's some common points with what Jesus says, but you're taking it into this kind of, like a enlightenment based individualism or market dogma where markets reign supreme, and so you've made humans into a market unit, economic unit. Is that what you're doing? I mean, just push back a little bit about some of the, I guess what I mean is that a lot of folks might share critique with you about the state from a Christian standpoint, right?
Yes.
But they tend to go anarcho-leftist, where they want to also gut the markets and gut the property rights because they find a case for that with Christ. Do you
Mhm.
see that case? And if not, how do you push back against the idea that your paradigm is still not challenging the tyranny of private property and markets as a dogma?
Okay. I make a distinction. I don't spell it out explicitly in the book, but just in my own mind, there's a distinction between being an individual and being atomized, where you're atomized being you're not connected to anything else.
Right.
I also make a distinction between um, I don't like self-autonomy as a term because it sounds like I can do whatever I want. And of course, well, no, you can't, because if what you want violates someone else, you that should be a boundary that you shouldn't cross. So I talk more about the authority of personhood.
Right.
And so those are grounded in dignity and natural human rights. And of course, the the natural limit on our properly exercised natural human rights are the rights of each other, and operating on consent and really getting to know the other person as a human being. Um, so the I appreciate the pushback if I were trying to tell people that you other others don't matter, social connections don't matter.
Yeah.
This book is not against community. It's not against social associations. It's not against relationships. It's not against people working together. It's not against people being different and therefore relying on each other to make each other's lives better, because you do something well that I don't do very well, but maybe I do something well that you don't do so well, or maybe you don't have the time to do. So I'm not arguing against connection and against human fabric. I'm arguing against a, in some ways, a fake social fabric that's imposed
Yeah.
violently rather than something that is truly dignified. And I've heard all the things that Jesus is somehow against private property. I don't find that at all. Jesus and his followers rely on donations from other people. It's right there in the Gospel of Luke when they talk about it. They have benefactors. They handle money. They need physical needs to be met. They need places to rest. They need food to eat. They're
I
going to
think
need
the
clothes and
cleansing of the
shoes.
temple is private property right too. Get out of my property. This is my dad's house. Get off my lawn.
Well, that's a good one. I don't go through that in the book, but the
Yeah.
cleansing of the temple is Jesus isn't against exchange. He's against fraud.
Right.
Remember what's happening in the temple there. Um,
Yeah.
you're a devout Israelite, a devout Jew, and you're coming in from outside of Jerusalem,
Yeah.
and you're going to Jerusalem to make your sacrifice.
Yeah.
And you show up with your unblemished lamb, but your lamb has to be inspected first before you can offer it for sacrifice. And you go up
Yeah.
there and they inspect your lamb, and oh, we're sorry. There's something wrong with your lamb. You can't use it. But all is not lost.
Hmm.
We have unblemished lambs for sale right here
Yeah. Yeah.
that you can purchase.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then you can go. And of course, they're coming in from outlying areas with different kinds of money. So it's like, oh, we don't expect that money. We don't accept that money here, but you can exchange it there for our money. And of course, they're taking a little off the top as they do that,
Yeah. Yeah.
their fee. So when Jesus shows up with the whip, he doesn't whip anybody.
Yeah.
He takes the whip, he cracks it. And what happens when animals hear a
Yeah.
loud sound
They
like a
run.
cracking
Yeah.
whip?
Yeah.
They start running. So now Jesus creates a mini stampede. And now everybody, what do? Oh my goodness, we got to get these animals under control. And so while everybody's attention is diverted, Jesus flips the tables because he's against the fraud that's going on, not
Eh,
the fact that people trade with each
yeah.
other.
Yeah. And not just that, it's also that the word that they use for those folks in the Greek, it can be translated as revolutionary figures. So these are folks that are raising funds for their ethno zealot cause to take back against Rome. So going back to what you're saying, the rejection of the violent spirit of mob revolution, those
Yes.
folks are they're fundraising. Not only are they fraud,
Campaign
and
contributions.
they're also trying to raise money for terrorism to fight back against the tyrants, right? So they're trying to do the very zealot thing that ends up getting their whole place destroyed in 70 AD. And he's, that's why he's like, I'm not for this. This is not what you're not supposed to use this place as a house to plot violent revolution. This is
Yes,
a place for
correct.
prayer. This is for peace,
Yeah, this is for our better self, not for our worse
2,000
self.
years later, we haven't even realized that yet because we're always,
No.
I want a King Caesar to come save me from all these degenerates. I need to raise some army. We need a dictator. We need a right wing Caesar. Oh, boo, boo, boo. All this blabbering. And it's coming from folks who call themselves traditional conservative Christians. And it's very embarrassing to me because we need people to think clearly about these things. And it takes a humble heart to recognize that you cannot keep begging for Caesar 2,000 years after Jesus defeated the powers on the cross. I mean, it's kind of
Yes.
I asked that to N.T. Wright one time. He's a theologian. I've heard of him, but he talks a lot about the powers being defeated. And I think he's very smart and very articulate. He's considered like some people call him the C.S. Lewis of modern Anglicanism and so forth in the books he's written. But, I said, you say the powers were defeated 2,000 years ago, and yet, you still want to use those same powers. Please, Mr. Powers, can you help my, friends stop doing drugs by putting them in a cage where they can be assaulted? Like, how's that going to help the situation? How are you actually living as if the powers were defeated if you're still begging for their help to coercively control your society 2,000 years after Christ defeated them and made a show of them? It just, there's just so much misunderstanding going on still.
I appreciate it very much, and I get into that because as a Christian living today, especially in the Western world, we're supposed to appreciate the goodness of government. To
Yeah.
be
Right.
a good
Right.
Christian is to be a good citizen, isn't it?
Right.
And
Yeah.
I go through this. I think this happens, and I drill down to it in my reflection on Station 2, which is where Jesus takes his cross. And I write in there because I'm talking about how carrying your cross has been turned into a really vague metaphor instead of
Right.
the reality of what it is. And I write, but as Christianity during and after the reign of the Roman Emperor Constantine, early 4th century AD, becomes politically acceptable, the notion of carrying one's cross becomes distorted. After all, so-called Christians now occupy prominent positions within the hierarchical social order. So-called Christians share in the exercise of coercive civil authority. So-called Christians can violently impose the cross on others. What great progress for so-called Christian citizenship. What great loss for true Christian neighborliness. And we're still fighting that because the powers haven't been defeated because we keep resurrecting them.
Yeah. 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 Exactly.
Human beings keep giving new life to those powers
Yeah.
every time we gravitate toward
So
imposed
true.
order. Every time we gravitate toward coercive civil authority, whether it's an official government with titles
Wow.
and fancy
So
titles,
true.
or whether it's your cartel, your gang,
Yeah.
your band of revolutionaries who don't want to really undermine government. They just want to put their favorite people in
That's
charge.
why J6 was a total disaster, right? A mob comes to take on the powers, and they gave the powers more powers. How did you think that would happen? Read the book of the Bible.
And those people there at
Oh
J6,
goodness.
they weren't against the government. They were like I remember saying this in 2016, early 2017, when we had all those Hillary Clinton protesters out protesting Trump's inauguration. And people say, isn't this wonderful? All these people protesting government. Aren't you someone who protests government? Wouldn't you join them? And my response is, those people aren't protesting government. Those people worship government.
Exactly.
They're
Yeah.
throwing a fit because in their minds, a
Yeah.
disfavored person became high priest.
Yep, that's right.
If they
Yeah.
actually were protesting government, you're right, I'd be there with them.
Man, why
But they're
can't Pope
not
Francis
protesting
talk like
government.
this? Can you write a letter to Pope Francis, see if we can get him on board this? Come on, we got to take.
I don't know if he'd take my calls. Remember,
If you're gonna
I'm a
talk the
nobody.
talk, you got to walk the walk. Come on, Pope
Gotta walk the.
Francis. Come on, we need to.
Well, I tell
Dominic,
you
send
what,
your book to them, to him. You know,
I've written a letter to him.
say something nasty about the capitalists. Just throw it in there, and he'll read it. If you put that in the
He'll
first
read it
sentence.
if I do that.
Yeah, write a little handwritten note on top, a sticky note. We hate capitalists. Just say that, and then just give him the book and see if that helps. You know, he needs to have something.
This book is under 10,000 words, so
There you go.
it's probably shorter than many of the things that get written as encyclicals, or
Yeah.
it's much shorter than, like you said, the tax code. It's shorter than someone was telling me their master's thesis was 11,000 words. I said, well, you'll like this. It's shorter than your master's thesis. The
Yeah.
average adult reads about 230 to 240 words a minute. This is under an hour read for the average adult.
Mhm.
If you want to go slow and actually use it as a meditative aid, of course, you can be longer than that. But if you just wanted to read this, it's a 40-minute read. If you just went straight through introduction, each of the 5 chapters, and even the small closing prayer that I put there. It's not a long read at all. So sure, popes, bishops. I joke that I don't know that any hardcore churchgoers have found my book yet, because I have not gotten any 1-star reviews on Amazon.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm waiting for the hardcore pro-state, pro-government, pro-order, pro-kingdom Christians to find this book and to just rail against it.
Yeah.
But I've been pleasantly surprised that there have been a lot of people who maybe don't identify strongly as Christian.
Yeah.
You made a great point earlier about Jesus talking about the kingdom of God being present now, but in plural, not in just singular. I think every human being has grace, even if you don't have a Christian tradition. And I think there's a lot of people who've been finding my book through the anarchist and freedom vein rather than the hardcore church-going vein.
Right. Yeah.
And the response from the people who just are looking for dignified freedom has been really wonderful to me.
Yeah.
Now, I would love for people who are hardcore churchgoers to find the book as well.
Yeah.
And I think they each have. But the fact that when you start talking about the themes of dignity and as to what Jesus really went through and what he was really trying to show people, I think you reach the terrible political metaphor would be across the aisle. I don't want to say that. I think you reach beyond the confines of people's traditions and cultures. And I think that dignity and natural human rights, meaning those valid claims we can make simply because we're human beings. I think those things and dignified defiance and flattening these hierarchical imposed social orders, I think that's a language that stretches beyond tradition. And I think that's how we get to that plural you were talking about, where more people find that goodness. It doesn't matter to me whether they find the name Jesus and the tradition of Jesus first and then learn dignity, or if they are seeking dignity and freedom first and then later on they find out, oh my goodness, that was the message of Christ.
Yes.
I don't care in what order they find those. As long as they keep moving in the right direction, eventually they're going to find both of them. They're going to find anarchy and they're going to find Christ, and they're not going to find a conflict there.
Yeah, and I call the folk, and I play with the words because I don't like words being the way they end up closing people's minds. The folks who are statists are really the anarchists. You know, they're the ones that are disagreeing and disobeying Christ's rulership in reality. Okay.
No way.
Let's be truthful about let's reclaim the territory of the words, you know, because we're not the anarchists. We're the folks who promote order. You know, we're the ones who follow the way of Christ, which is orderly in the true sense of the word. In the sense of our perspective, you know, we want top-down solutions, which creates chaos. Actually, it's anarcho-tyranny is a popular term now, but that's really what the folks on left and right are doing. They're demanding anarcho-tyranny, and you know, that's not the way of God. The way of God is order. I mean, you look at the beauty of creation; it's beautiful because it's orderly. You know, you look at the beauty of of a tree. You look at the beauty of animals. This is all order. It's beautiful, and
Hmm.
it's got form and it's got structure to it, and that's the way we should socially order ourselves. Like, for example, you're not against, probably I would say, hierarchy in and of itself. You're against the way in which we order hierarchy through initiation of violence, right? Would you
I'm
say?
against the imposed hierarchy. I'm not against hierarchies of values because, of course, we're supposed to have that, and Christ teaches us to have that.
Yeah,
I'm not against hierarchies of proprietorship. Um, Ownership of property is not only about use; it's about responsibility. Jesus talks frequently about stewards and stewardship. I mean,
yeah,
stewardship is like having a job where you're employed by somebody. You know,
yeah,
there's an owner, and they delegate some of their property to you. So I'm not against hierarchies of proprietorship. I'm
right,
also not against hierarchies of competence because those are also things that are self-evident
right.
and logical, and again, uh, demonstrated by Christ. I'm against imposed hierarchical social orders. I'm against the idea that there are levels of human dignity
Yeah.
and that somehow being in a higher level of human dignity allows you a double standard of violating other people in
Right.
ways that they cannot violate you.
Well, that's
I'm
where,
against the
yeah,
imposed
yeah.
hierarchy.
So that's where the works like Rene Girard's stuff is very helpful to give us uh, more information as to why these states look the way they do and have the assumptions they have. For example, this idea of like folks in power having a certain rule set that we're not allowed to have, that actually comes from the way in which kings arose in history, which were sacrificial victims that delayed their execution. So this idea that we would take folks who would be groomed for a position of sacrifice, and a way in which you groom them is by giving them a kind of divine special privilege to enjoy things like, well, this is what they did in a lot of different cultures in primitive societies. They would capture slaves from a different tribe or whatever, and they would give them access to orgies, and they'd give them access to massive feasts, and they would let them do taboo behavior that everybody else couldn't do. And then at a certain point, they would sacrifice them. This is where we get Saturnalia as a festival. Remember the worship of Saturn.
Okay.
And you get these different rituals where and they do this in South America, ancient societies, where you would groom up and give them extra privileges. They don't have to follow the same prohibitions that the ordinary person is, but it's because they transgress so much that they are then used as a vicarious sacrifice to atone for the collective angers, tensions, and irritations of the community.
Okay.
So this Girard posits, you pull it back far enough into prehistory, and we can see this pattern happening on a kind of spontaneous level. That someone who, in a sea of sameness, when people are competing to the point where they become almost identical with one another, like we see with left and right, that sea of sameness, when you get to that state, when a society breaks down, usually because of lack of food or resources or
Mm-hmm.
sickness, some kind of a scandal or a plague of some sort, famine, triggers that irritation. That sea of sameness becomes very violent and volatile. And you can imagine that someone who stands out in kind of an arbitrary way with some arbitrary differences, maybe they're too short, too small, too tall, too rich, too old, a king that's been on the throne too long, is a candidate for sacrifice because they need to be someone who stands out somewhat so that there's not a revenge when you kill him, because if you kill a
Mm-hmm.
guy and he's got a lot of people fighting you, you didn't create catharsis. You didn't create unity. You create more friction and fighting and infighting.
Yeah.
So this is where we get this notion, and that's where taboos are often levied at a person who looks different. Oh, you broke this taboo. You broke that taboo. You're guilty of incest, or like Oedipus. Remember,
Mm-hmm.
we still are blaming poor Oedipus to this day in therapeutic culture. We have Oedipal
Right. Right.
complex. We still assume he did all the stuff they said he did. How do we know that? He's probably didn't. The winners write the history books, in other words, right?
Right.
Except for where the Bible comes in, where the victor
Yes.
is the one who is supposedly defeated by the winners of history. And ever
Yes.
since then, now victims write history books. Now the victim's voice starts to cry out and contend against the winner's crowd, right? And now there's contention. Now there's real wrestling with God because we don't have any stable structure of governance anymore. So my point in saying all that is just to say, whether you are a principled anarchist or voluntarist or not, I make the case, because I've kind of bypassed the argument about should we have a state in some kind of abstract sense, or, let's philosophize. Should we have a state, and should we have ever had a state, and all this stuff? I get right to the point. Jesus destroyed the powers. He destroyed their unifying mechanism of sacrificial violence. He destroyed their believability. He destroyed their myth-making monopoly of making order through violence, right? Mm-hmm. He beat it. He exposed it on the cross. He showed it for what it was. And now it's going to continually fall apart the longer we continue in history, 2,000 years after he set in motion his new world order. So it's whether
we learn the lessons.
You see what I mean? So we can almost bypass the philosophical debate for a moment and get everybody on board with this notion that history is going somewhere. Christ set it in motion. The powers are falling apart. So whether we could have had a state in the past or not, let's all agree that the states around the world, monopoly governance and their cronies, are falling apart because of what Christ did to them on the cross and is doing through history against them. And so we can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. So I'm basically making a case for pragmatic voluntarism. You see what I mean?
Yes.
It helps create a bigger tent. Okay, you want to be a socialist, you want to be you think we should have had a monarchy at some point in the old days when we had medieval ages. Oh, you want this or that. At the end of the day, those are all great theories, and we can just agree to disagree on all the particularities and come together with the reality that the state is falling apart. And the pragmatic move to make is not to try to revivify it. I like the way you put it, that we're trying to resurrect the powers. That's a really good, very anthropologically rich statement you just made there. Instead of trying to revivify the powers, we have to learn to build something outside of it. And that's the kingdom of heaven,
And I like how you brought out, you don't want to just get stuck in pure philosophy and pure theory. One of the wonderful things about the Stations of the Cross and about Jesus's persecution is that it's not only theory, it's practice.
Right.
It's real history, it's real events that happen. And I really like your description, which I hadn't heard before, of where some of these kingships and regimes came from of sacrificing. When I hear you describe that, what I notice is that ancient peoples were looking ways to externalize whatever problems they were having and to find a quicker solution out there somewhere. And you had read some of the boilerplate introduction to my book that appears on the back cover and at the book selling platforms. I want to read you the portion that occurs right after what you just read, because it's part of the introduction. Right after it's saying being a good neighbor requires a different mindset and value system than being a good citizen, and they often conflict. I go through how they conflict. Good neighbors treat each other as peers. Good citizens treat each other according to official status. Good neighbors seek the personal, intimate betterment of themselves and each other. Good citizens seek the external validation of an impersonal system.
That's true.
Good neighbors align to voluntary, open-ended interactions. Good citizens align to coercive civil authority and imposed hierarchical social orders. Good neighbors insource their ethics. Charity and friendship are the key virtues of their relationships. Good citizens outsource their ethics. Compliance with the commands of rulers and enforcers is a fundamental and necessary aspect. Some might call it a civic virtue. And last one, good neighbors consent. Good citizens conform.
Yeah.
So that's also goes back to your question about my answer about individualism. I'm against atomization, but I'm not against individualism because consent happens at the level of the individual. There is no such thing. I don't care how many times a politician says it. There is no such thing as the will of the people.
Right. Yeah.
That does not exist. The will exists at the level of the individual with agency. Now, you might find consensus in small groups, but again, that consensus only occurs if the individual will has found that agreement.
Yeah.
The individual is where will happens. The individual is where deliberation happens and where virtue happens.
Yeah.
Because virtue can only happen where a will is in operation. So the virtue happens at the level of the individual. Faith happens at the level of the individual. Even the faith that you share with others, it has to come from you first and you bring it to share. So all of these things that Christ is teaching us have to happen at the level of the individual. They are
Like the person.
insourced.
Yeah.
They're not outsourced. They're not externally
Yeah.
imposed. They are
On a human
internally
level.
discovered.
Yeah, yeah. On a human level, you would still say it would come
Human.
from God, right? From the, but yeah, on the
Yes,
outsource.
your soul, that glimpse of the
Yeah.
transcendence is
Yeah.
your soul. That
Yeah.
comes from God, and it's up to you to discover that. Remember, old paganism polytheists, they
Yeah.
create their gods and their heavens in their own image.
Yeah. Yep.
What
Yeah.
distinguishes Christianity and some of early
Yeah.
Israelite Judaism as it progresses is they move away from that and they learn, wait a minute, we're created in God's image.
Right.
So instead of creating the heavens and the
Right.
gods in your image as a human, what aspects do I find comfortable?
Yeah.
What things do I prefer? What makes me pleased and satisfied?
Yeah.
Instead, we say, no, this stirring in my soul, the sense of something more, the sense of the transcendent, that's God. And I'm created in God's image because I have that glimpse. And now it's my job to figure out what
Yeah.
God really is and use that to better myself, not create God in my image
Yeah.
and then make God do what I want.
Right. Yeah.
The externalizing, the paganism
Yeah.
is creating the gods in your own image.
Right.
Jesus is trying to get us to discover the true God in us and then what that means for our lives and our growth.
And unfortunately, with word thinking, many people create a paganized God of Jesus, the name Jesus too. So that's a big problem.
They create a paganized God of the Bible.
Yeah, yeah.
Where the Bible becomes clericalism. And, you know, we talked about Pope Francis earlier. Pope Francis has railed against clericalism, where people just basically worship the church hierarchy. No, that's not what you're supposed to do. You know, the map is not the terrain.
Right, yeah.
Right? The map of a building is not the building itself.
Yeah,
right?
I think what you said about the resurrecting the powers is applicable here to what you're talking about, because when Rene Girard says that we do not invent our gods, we deify our victims. So when you talk about making gods in our own image, that's the culture of death, because you're talking about actually you're projecting our own victims of sacrificial violence into the skies and resurrecting them as gods. That's why we have so many dying and rising myths in stories. We have Horus, we have other gods that are dying and rising, right?
Sure.
And so when you talk about resurrecting the powers, that's what we are trying, in not necessarily consciously, maybe we think we're not doing it intentionally, but we are in effect trying to resurrect the powers every time we sacrifice a neighbor to a rape cage called prison for a victimless vice or a nonviolent, action. Every time we kill somebody in another foreign conflict, whether it's through a proxy war or through sanctions, starving them, or regime change conflicts, we are sacrificing these victims. And in some sense, these victims are tokens for an attempt to resurrect the powers, just like the pagan structure was cyclical and it always had sacrifices related to the seasons. That was always about, you basically, Girard's idea is that at the foundation stone of someone like a Zeus is actually a victim too, is actually a victim of sacrifice. Because when you sacrifice someone in a spontaneous lynching in a primordial prehistory context, the extraordinary ecstasy of relief of tension that you had between your neighbor is vicariously mediated out onto the back of the target. So they become, at first, they were a monster because they were accused of breaking taboos, incest, bestiality, some kind of boundary of differentiation. Once that culminates into a snowballing of unification of the community against the common enemy, the killing of the enemy releases such catharsis and relief that you then remember the person, as you recall that event later on, as must have been someone beyond human, must have been someone who was there to teach us a lesson. about what we do when we're at the wit's end and we're about to obliterate each other because of a famine or a plague. So why do you sacrifice humans for the great harvest to come, right? So that if there is a harvest famine, we don't, our ancestors, we hear through oral tradition and mythology, had to sacrifice a tribute who was actually, you go back enough, it's like a Russian doll. You pull off the layers and you get endless sacrifices that ultimately culminate in the actual remembrance of these events as a god, as something beyond the society itself as individuals, and someone who has some kind of supernatural power to heal the community. And that's why so many of the mythological gods that we see, like in Greek tradition, have both a monstrous side and a salvific side, because the monstrous side of their stories correlate to their kind of first stage of being an accusatory vessel for bad behavior, right? They're mischief makers. And then when they're murdered, those gods are then resurrected in the community as a spirit of camaraderie and togetherness and joy and happiness. And that creates unity, that creates strength, that creates a stable society that can prosper and get along and thrive, so to speak, for a time, seasonally, right?
That's the belief, right?
And that creates salvation, which is why some of these gods, they're mischief makers in their early stages, in their teen years, so to speak, in mythology, and then they end up doing some kind of salvific act to save them from a plague or a war or something. So that's the kind of dual kind of Janus-faced. Michael Hardin is a guy that calls it Janus-faced. A Janus-faced god that has both a kind of capricious side that can go really very vicious and violent and taboo, and then very, very orderly and salvific. And I think that's exactly what, when you said that, resurrecting the powers, that's what we're trying to do every day, is we're trying to say, give me back that God that can give me free health care, but lock anybody up that speaks ill of me or looks differently from me, can pave the roads, but can burst into someone's house and shoot them because they tweeted something about the president. You know what I mean? These kind of terrible, he's like, that's the Janus-faced push-pull God. That's the God that we make in our image, because that tend to be the way we relate to one another in our fallen nature, right?
Yes.
We don't want an unconditionally loving God, and we don't want an unconditionally loving government or order, because that's not attractive to us. We want the hard to get type of government, so to speak. You know what I mean? That kind of push-pull dynamic.
I think it's almost the reverse of being hard to get. Government exists because it's easy.
Right.
It is it's more challenging and takes more attention and effort to be a voluntarist.
Yeah.
And to have to insource your ethics.
Well, sure,
to have to deal with people voluntarily.
But look at the figures that we put up. Oh, they're hard to get. Hillary Clinton, nobody wants to trust her with watching your kids. Let's put it that way, okay?
No.
You know what I mean? That's the kind of, but then she can also be benevolent and give you great abundance. Theoretically, she can give you free health care. She can give you women's rights.
Somebody else.
You see what I mean? It's kind of a hard to get. It's hard. You can't. It's an untouchable kind of divine status that is allowed to be bad, and it makes you attracted to them.
The whole Jesus is a socialist thing. Like, well, Jesus fed people. Jesus gave people free health care, and the answer to that is Jesus didn't steal it from somebody else first.
Yeah.
Jesus didn't steal somebody else's bread to feed the 5,000.
Yeah.
Jesus didn't steal somebody else's services and knowledge and everything to do his healings. He didn't steal first.
Right.
Government is the easy way out. It allows you to outsource your thinking. It allows you to outsource your allegiance. It allows you to outsource your journey of virtue to something else.
Very good.
And it's always the other guy, right?
Yep.
You were saying, it's always the devil is always those other people.
Right.
Not us when we resurrect the power.
That's why
it's only them.
Yeah, and that's why politicians are a scapegoat. They misdirect your attention away from the system. The police are a scapegoat. Every time a bad law has to be enforced, if it goes wrong and someone gets killed, you blame the police, right? You see what I mean? We have layers and layers of scapegoats that we construct that obfuscate our moral responsibility for continuing the sorry system that we don't want, but we somehow keep going back to, like a dog to the vomit.
I wrote a blog post called "Whose Side Are You On?" That grew out of something I go through in this book, which is how awful the ordinary people are of this time. It's not just the leaders. It's not just the enforcers. It's the ordinary people who cheer for this stuff and who want it to be around because it comforts them.
Right.
And the question was, are you a populist? And I said, no, because I'm against the elites, but I'm also against all of the populist saviors.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm against that too. There's something
Barabbas was a populist.
Who?
Barabbas was a populist.
Barabbas was a populist, and there was only one good citizen among Jesus's close friends, Judas.
Yeah.
There's your good citizen. The part of the part of the book is Station 12, where Jesus dies on the cross.
Mm-hmm.
And this was the one that I thought would turn people against it if they were with me so far, because it's the kind of thing that takes this out of being, oh, it's those guys who are terrible, and makes you examine your own as much. I talk about Jesus dying on the cross, and then I say, good cops killed Jesus. Not bad cops, not rogue cops, not corrupt cops. Good cops.
Mm-hmm.
The ones who obey orders and follow their training and protocols. The ones who care about their communities and keep the streets safe and secure. The ones who are just doing their jobs and trying to go home to their families. Hey, they don't make the rules, they just enforce them. Stop resisting. Good cops kill Jesus. And I go through, loyal law enforcers are the engine of the monopoly violence institution. Without them, the authority claimed by the high status ruling class is impotent. Without them, the civic virtue claimed by the proudly compliant and often cowardly ordinary people feels unrewarded.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm also I'm not just going after the people who get sent to the front lines. I'm going after everybody who cheers for this stuff. Everybody who cheers for this stuff has to examine their conscience here. Everybody who deep down wants this, because it's an easy way out to just outsource your ethics and to say, well, that guy just should have just complied. It's his fault that they violated him. Oh, well, honest mistake. He's just got to live with it. That's the price. That's the collateral damage.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Everybody who cheers for this stuff, and I include me in that because I wasn't always like this.
Mm-hmm.
It took me a long time to figure out that sacrificing and considering the great worth in things like government and imposed society, which is what the word worship means, by the way. Your worship is your highest value, your high values that you're willing to sacrifice for. So yes, people do worship government.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They will absolutely sacrifice for it.
Yeah.
They'll give over their campaign contributions. They'll stump for candidates.
Take experimental products and injure themselves for the
absolutely. They'll take the ridiculous gene therapy injection.
Yeah, you got to be careful. We got to get this on YouTube.
Okay, so I won't say the C word.
The greatest medical product ever invented is what we call it.
Okay, yes, yeah. They will take the greatest medical product ever invented because somebody told them to do it. And perhaps they get injured from it and still blame something else. It's like, thank goodness I took the greatest medical product ever invented, or it would have been worse. I'm now seeing headlines at news sources where people are saying that their relative died, but thank goodness they took the greatest medical product ever invented, or it would have been worse.
Yeah.
Really? It would have been worse than dying?
Yeah.
Thank goodness I got the greatest
That's superstition.
Medical product.
That's superstitious fealty to the state for sure.
Well, it's the desire for control. I say in the closing prayer, I ask a question. Does this mean humans may violently impose upon each other in accomplishing God's will? And I say no. God is all powerful and all knowing, but not all controlling.
Right.
The urge to control is a human desire based on human psychological weakness. It is not a divine characteristic. When people tell me God is in control, I tell them, no, he's not. No, control is a human desire based on human weakness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Don't project that onto God.
Mm-hmm.
Don't put your weakness onto God.
Mm-hmm.
And you talked before about how the pagan gods get sacrificed and then resurrected as something else. The reason why I write a book about the way of the cross and the details that are up to Jesus's death and after it, it's because I don't want people to turn Jesus into a pagan god.
Yeah, it's true.
Where Jesus
too late. They've been doing it for 2,000 years.
Right. Where Jesus' death becomes just like any other pagan god.
But But the text itself says they're going to do that, right? Because it says, I always point out that the earliest manuscripts about Barabbas call him Jesus Barabbas. Jesus, actually,
Okay.
so there's a tale of two Jesuses in the story. And
Right.
bar means of Abba, the Father. So there's two Jesuses of the Father. And the
Yes, right.
question is, which one is the crowd going to choose? Is it going to choose the William Wallace type Jesus Barabbas, who wants
Uh-huh.
to, have a revolution and kick these scoundrels out by force, or do they want the Jesus who says, no, look in the mirror and see what you have and what your sin looks like and how much it mirrors your oppressor? That's kind of
Mhm.
a wet blank. That's like pouring water on a crowd. And so obviously
Yes.
they choose Barabbas, the Jesus of violence. And I say 2,000 years, that text is a prophecy, because 2,000 years, most of the crowd tends to choose the Barabbas Jesus since then, they want the Barabbas way of doing Jesus, not the actual Jesus. The Jesus of history is always expelled from the crowd, usually, you know.
Yes. Oh
So,
yeah.
but here's the grace of God. Even though most of us, to various degrees, have a Barabbas in mind for Jesus, God still works through that stupidity to bring us through his grace and mercy. And that's the beautiful thing, right? It's such, is
I
that he's very, very generous with his benevolence and mercy, and in
the
our
final
lives.
chapter is called Mercy.
Yeah.
I title each of the chapters sort of a common thread for each of the three stations. And it goes through sentencing, sharing, courage, hatred, and finally mercy. And I talk about that in the same station 12 with Jesus dying on the cross. I bring up the fact that at least some of the Roman enforcers who witness what happens to Jesus, they seem to have a change of emotion right there. And I wonder if they'll be welcomed. I say, after this change of emotion, will the centurion who had the centurions, will the centurion also have a change of mind and heart? If so, what will be his recourse and how will other people react to him? If good neighborliness is to increase in the world, then good citizens from all levels of the imposed hierarchical social order must be welcomed into bettering their values, perspectives, behaviors, and commitments. All people must have a real opportunity to turn away from deficient acts and attitudes and forge a new way forward. Yes, the world is awash in the calamities of good citizenship, the distorting of status, loyalty, and validation, the exalting of coercive civil authority, the outsourcing of ethics, the justifying of violence and hate. But the story doesn't have to end there. And then I give the final chapter on mercy,
Very
because
good.
there should be a way. God is never outdone in his mercy.
Yeah.
God is never outdone in his good neighborliness. Right? The lessons of Jesus is not that everything is terrible. The lessons of Jesus is there's a better way to act even in the midst of things that are terrible. And it may not seem evident in the moment, but there's a good reason to do that.
Very good. Well, I think this has been a fascinating conversation, and I'm excited for people to check out your book. So tell us where they can go to your Substack and the title of your book and where they can get it.
You can search for Good Neighbor, Bad Citizen on Amazon.com, at BarnesandNoble.com, and at Lulu.com. You can find Good Neighbor, Bad Citizen on Substack. Search for me there. My name is Domenic Scarcella. So that may be another thing that helps people find. David, I can send you quick links that I have for the book and the Substack. And
Sure.
if I may ask you in the show notes, can you put some links to your favorite um, articles or descriptions of Rene Girard? Because I'd like to
Sure.
learn
Yeah.
even more about him, because I do think there's a
Yeah.
tie-in. So I
Yeah.
wasn't writing something that was, completely off the wall. I was writing something that
Yeah.
was gospel based, and that other conscientious thinkers,
There's
I think have
multiple
have
disciplines
explored
can get you
themselves.
to the same truth of God. Yes, for sure.
Right, right.
Very
So
good.
that's where you can find it. It's a very short book. It's a quick read. It's a very simple cover. It says "Good Neighbor, Bad Citizen," and then the sub title there. Those who can watch us on
Yeah.
video, I'm trying to hold it up to the camera, but it's it's meant to be something that we can all get into. I didn't
Yeah.
write it like a doctoral thesis. I didn't write it like a scholar who's just writing for other scholars. I wrote this for other
Yeah.
conscientious, attentive people who want to make the effort. because I
Right.
think we're all capable of that.
Yes.
That's a
No.
quality we each
Yeah, I agree. I
can do,
agree.
right?
It's about, people sell themselves short way too much in their responsibility. They
We
can
would
handle a
just
lot
make the
more.
effort, right?
Yeah,
We
exactly.
can do it. And Jesus wants us to do that, and it'll help us get there.
Very good. Thank you for your time, Dominique. It's a
Thank
pleasure
you.
talking to you. And for those of you who want to stay in touch with us at A Neighbor's Choice, remember you can email us hello@aneighborschoice.com. I'm David Gornoski. Godspeed.